Hello, everyone. This is Bob Lowe, CSIA Executive Director. Thank you for attending the July CSIA webinar. As explained in the promotion, today's webinar is primarily the content of Jeff's conference presentation that had great reviews, plus the webinar focus at this time is project management, so it's a perfect fit. Be sure to ask questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and questions will be answered during the webinar, so be sure to ask them. The webinar will be archived for later viewing, and the slides will be available also. The host and sponsor of our monthly webinars is Software Toolbox, a CSIA partner member. Software Toolbox helps system integrators lower their risk on projects that involve software by providing them a unique mix of off-the-shelf software products and rapid response technical support that minimizes the need for custom code and lowers field startup time risk. Now I'd like to introduce today's webinar presenter, Jeff Miller. Jeff is the Director of Project Management at Interstates Control Systems in Sioux Center, Iowa. He directs the company's project management and automation support teams, and he has successfully led his company through 4 CSIA certification audit cycles. Jeff is currently the Treasurer on the CSIA Board of Directors and has served 12 years on the CSIA Best Practices and Benchmarks Committee, 4 years as chairman. Jeff is a project management professional with PMI and is actively involved in the project management community through the Sioux Empire chapter of the Project Management Institute. So, without further delay, here's Jeff.
All right, thank you, Bob. Just want to let everybody on the call know, yes, please ask questions as we go. I will be booking through these slides pretty fast, but I will also put my phone number and email address at the end, and please feel free to contact me if you have questions about anything in particular. At the conference, I was able to do it in a little bit more of a workshop fashion, so they had a little bit more time to practice this. But if you got questions, feel free to contact me at any time. This is, I've done a lot of studying around project risk management and put together a process that I use with our project management team. At the end of this, I will give you a book that I picked up from Project Management Institute. It's an electronic read on their website, and it'll have the name of the book and the authors there. This book has got a lot of good information in it. It's probably the best risk management book that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. Very much liked it. So a lot of the principles that I'll be basing my presentation on came from that book, and we've been implementing them in a way that works well for our control industry. So let's just move into our presentation, and we'll get started here. So I'm going to use some terms. Some of you may be PMBOK or PMI certified in their project management body of knowledge. That's the kind of the Bible on project management worldwide, and has a lot of good information in it. But I'm just going to look at a couple of things that they would say about risk management. So it's an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives. And many times we don't think about the positive side, but we're going to look at that a little bit today as we talk as well, because we've really tried to implement some of that. The risk management side is really, it's how we increase the likelihood and impact of positive events and decrease it of the negative events. So we've got a process that we're going to follow to do that, but I'm just going to do some real basic, what is risk management, what does it look like, and then we'll get into some details on how to run a risk management meeting. So the typical problems are, and this is very typical, we plan, a lot of times as a project manager, we plan them without the help of the team. We just brainstorm on our own, come up with the risk. We don't create good mitigation plans for the risks that we find. We identify them and we don't do much with them. Or we identify them and it's kind of a once and done. We don't look at them again during the project. Or we don't assign risk owners. And we're actually going to cover that pretty good because that's one of those key areas that if you don't do well, you're basically creating a list of things that could go wrong. Nobody's responsible for them. Many of them will happen to you. So if you went into the PMBOK manual, though, the Project Management Body of Knowledge, these are the process steps that they would say make a successful risk management program. So you plan for risk management, you identify risk, perform these risk analysis steps. They have one called Qualitative and one called Quantitative, and I'll just talk about those terms in particular and what they really mean. Plan risk responses, and then you monitor and control risk. And that's really, if you follow those steps, you're going to be light years ahead of the guys that are just brainstorming lists. So we're going to really cover, I think, the two main areas that most guys don't do very well with is once you've identified the risk, really driving down to what's causing these and how can I mitigate the impact of them. So why do we plan? Why do you have to have a risk management plan for each project? Every project's got unique characteristics. You got different team members. We have lessons learned that we've learned on other projects that we want to make sure that we've shared with others. But really, we're going to plan out how we identify risk, analyze them, plan for the responses, and how we're going to monitor them on this project. Because large projects, you monitor them different than you do with small projects. So each project requires its own plan. This is the steps that we're going to kind of follow in this process. So this would follow right along with how PMBOK would say you would need to do it. But you're going to identify the risk, analyze them, prioritize them, resolve them, monitor them, and then start over the regular checkup for new project risks. And we're going to look at each one of these steps in just a little bit more detail. The risk model that this presentation is based on, this comes right out of the e-read book that I'll give you the information on at the end. But the key difference in this methodology is really this bottom section related to risk event drivers and impact drivers. Most of us identify risk events, and we'll identify impacts. You know, how much is it going to cost me if this happens? And we come up with some risk score and what we call here total loss. But we oftentimes don't drill down into the details of what's causing this risk. And that's where this methodology really helps to drill into. So we're going to look at that in a lot more detail when we get to the step on identifying risks. But one of the key things is make sure you've got the right people in the room for this risk meeting. We talked about way in the beginning of the presentation, sometimes we plan these things in a vacuum. We do them all by ourselves. It doesn't work. You need to have the right people in the room. Get your core team members. Maybe it's just your lead or your key technical people. If you've done these kinds of projects before, invite some people from the project that was similar to that. Many times you've got subject matter experts in your company that maybe have the expertise in this particular technology or this process that you're automating that aren't on the project. Make sure you invite them as well. Come with your risk register. We'll look at a couple of examples of that. And then have someone, if you can, have someone from outside the team facilitate the risk review meeting. The biggest piece there is make sure you're not the one taking notes for the risk meeting. You want somebody doing that because you want to participate very well in the meeting. And if you're the person running it, as well as trying to keep track of notes, you're just not going to be able to participate very well. So again, the key to success, build a cross-functional team. A couple other potential people to invite would be the estimator on the project if it isn't the PM, or your sales contact with the inside sales guy that did that, because they may have had some conversations with the owner or the general contractor that could potentially help you out, and maybe even your accountant. Sometimes there's financial risk associated with this particular client that they may remember from another project. So knowing those things can really help. Okay, we're going to jump into the identifying risk, and this is one of those where you got your team put together. You want to do this early in the day. Don't start too early, but you want this while everybody's brains are fresh. So, you know, if you start at 8 a.m., basically you're going to, you know, if you want, a lot of guys like to start with some type of a brain teaser to get their brains working, you know, throw a couple of brain teaser things up on the whiteboard or put them on an overhead, but get them thinking creatively. And then you give them just a brief description of what the project's about and anything as a project manager, nuances that you may have seen. Don't try to guide the process, though, of these are risks that I've already identified. Just really describe the project and any particular things that you think might be relevant. Just use standard brainstorming rules. You know, no idea is a bad idea. Throw them all up on the board. We're going to filter through those ideas as we get into the analyzing the risk side of it. And then make sure you've got a note taker there. But our core concepts here in identifying, you want to describe the scope of the project, who's involved, what technologies, deliverables that are expected, and time frames they're expected in. You're going to look at how do we focus on this one. I've got a couple of examples here that I'll show you. Some people do what they would throw a big schedule up on the board, of the project and how it's going to flow and all the different steps that are in the project. And I'm going to show you what sticky density is, but they use a form called sticky density. And the first time I had ever heard of this was in this book. A lot of us use project methodology, looking at the steps of our delivery. But then another one that I found to be very effective is this prompted list. And I'll show you an example prompted list in just a second. But remember, quantity is what we're after at this stage of that. So what's sticky density? So if you imagine in this diagram here that process step 1, 2.1, 2.2, these are basically your schedule up on the wall. And sticky density would be you basically give every participant in the room a notepad or a stack of stickies, and you have them write what they think risks are, and they post them next to the step on the schedule that those risks are related to. And the more sticky notes next to a particular process step kind of shows you that's our biggest risk areas. So if you only have one, like process step 2.1, it's probably not that risky, but things that have 3 and 4 might be the ones you really need to focus on. So that's what sticky density is. Sample prompted list, and you guys will get these the slides and you'll be able to zoom in and see these, but just from a main heading, having things like schedule, budget, deliverables, scope, resource, communications, acceptance testing, technology, those are the categories. And then in our prompted list, we have some items in there that we've identified over time that these could typically be risk in any project. So be thinking about them in those terms. So that's what you use a prompted list for. But remember that all risks aren't bad. We actually just recently had an example of this in one of our projects. If a client has a whole bunch of future potential work, and this is the first project that you're getting to try out with them, if you do well on this project and you alleviate some of the pains they've had in the past, you have the opportunity to get a lot more work. We had a particular project that they only gave us a very small project, somewhere in the $100,000 range, but there was well over $1.5 million worth of work that they were going to be doing in the next year. And so we were really trying to secure that. So we had our project manager. That was the risk that hit the register. I had a huge negative risk on the register, so I did a little brainstorming with him to find out why he had this. It was a $500,000 risk on his register, and obviously caught a lot of people's eyes. So I did a little digging, found out it was really a $500,000 positive risk that we already had a good mitigation plan in there, or what I would call an exploitation plan for a positive risk, and but had it on the risk register wrong. So it raised a lot of red flags when it didn't need to be, but it was something that he was doing a very good job of identifying those other risks that are out there that are positive versus the negative ones. Our next step is in the analyzing piece, and this is one we're gonna spend some time on, and then there's another step. Think of step number 4. We'll spend a little bit more time on, because these are kind of the key areas. If you can do well at these, you're gonna do really well in your risk management side. So the goal here: determine which risks are significant enough to actively manage. You're gonna look at what are the reasons you think these risks are going to occur. So that would be what I would call, and the book would call, a risk driver. The reason that risk, why we think this risk might occur. We're going to look at the dollar impact. You're going to look at the reasons you think it'll be that dollar impact, and that would be the impact driver. And then you're going to look at the probabilities for this risk and its impact. And then you're going to calculate in your risk register a risk score, which basically is your impact times your probability, and that gives you a score. It's a dollar amount in our case. Some people just use numbers, and they don't really relate it to dollars. We choose to use dollars because that's something that we can show. It's fairly easy to come up with those numbers in your project. So what we're going to do here, though, this is an individual risk that's been identified. This is the steps you would go through to analyze a specific risk. So you're going to develop the risk driver first. You're going to look at the risk event, say what's the driver for these risks, and I'll give you a couple examples here. Then you're going to look at estimating its probability, develop an impact driver. So now what's driving this impact to be the dollar amount that they came up with, and then the next thing would be estimate the impact probability. Now, I'll be the first to tell you what we typically do is we just identify one probability here, just the risk event probability, or what we think the probability of this risk happening. The book would have you do your risk event probability times your impact probability times the total impact, and that would come up with your risk score. So it does lower your risk score when you do it that way, but in most cases anyway. So a couple of examples here. This is fairly typical. You're in a risk review meeting and the risk comes up, I think we're going to slip the schedule by 2 weeks. So you have to start asking why questions. When you start looking at developing the risk event drivers, you need to ask why you think we're going to slip the schedule for 2 weeks. And we're going to be looking at some impacts here too, but so the reasons, might be very, very different. Some people might think, well, I know my programmer that I have assigned to this project is running long on his last project, so he's not going to be able to start for 2 weeks. So that's what's the impact. That's what's really driving that slip of schedule by 2 weeks. Or I don't have my issue for construction drawings and I don't expect them for 2 weeks, and that kind of holds up my whole design process. Or we've worked with this client before in the past and they've always been late at getting started on projects. So, but when I start asking the why questions, the resources are determining what it is that what's really driving this 2 week slip in schedule. Now, obviously, if I've got a 2 week slip in schedule, I'm going to have some impact from that. I might be on site for 2 extra weeks. I might wind up having to rent equipment for 2 weeks longer. So those are my drivers of my impact. My impact, if I come up, like here, I came up with a $42,000 impact. The driver of it is I've got liquidated damages on this project that are $3,000 a day. 14 days late, it's going to be $42,000. So that's my drivers. My driver might also be, oh, I've got to keep the crew on site longer. It's going to cost me about $3,000 a day for this extra 2 weeks on site. So that would be another potential impact driver there. So you can see they're different, though, than somebody just saying, oh, I think we're going to have a 2-week slip and schedule. We're drilling down into why. Why do you think we're going to have a 2-week slip and schedule? So the key here, though, is we need to come up with what we would call a risk statement here. Now, I don't do this very frequently. What I did is I polled a lot of different project managers across multiple industries and said, what do you guys do for best practices? One particular company always states his risk statement like this: given that blank, there's a possibility that blank with a consequence that. So here you're saying, given that this particular event is going to happen, we're going to have these impacts, and that's basically, I'll show you an example of what this would look like in just a second. But we're going to build a plan to manage the risk and impact drivers, not the risk itself. Our mitigation plan has nothing to do with the individual risks themselves. It's really all about the drivers. And if we can manage the risk driver, we're changing the probability that risk will occur. If we manage the impact driver, it reduces the overall potential impact to the project. So that's kind of the big picture here. Really ask, how do we know this? You're going to have to drill in and ask a lot more questions to get down to these risk and impact drivers. Earlier on when I was showing you the PMBOK methodology, they talked about quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. And quantitative, really, to get it down to just layman's terms, which I need to have, it's just really more quantity type things. So number of work days that we might lose, number of calendar days that we might have to stay on site, the financial impact, which if you know work days and calendar days, you're going to be able to calculate. But if you go to qualitative, this would be more where you use ranges. You don't get exacts. So instead of saying it's a $42,000 impact, I say it's a 2% of it's basically 2 to 10% of my overall contract value, or it's less than 2% of my contract value. And I'll give you a couple examples of this, or it's a low, medium, or high probability. You don't use actual probabilities, you just use these scores. Some people will create a matrix where you just basically use 1 through 5, and you rank them, and you just look at your grid to say, well, anything that's in the upper half of this grid, we're going to manage. If it's anything in the bottom half of this grid, we're not going to manage. We still come up with a score on our end, but we do oftentimes limit the team to subsets. And that would be kind of as we looked at on this slide, the qualitative. Instead of giving them every number in the book, you give them ranges. So you might say, and sometimes we just use, we're going to have a 30%, a 60%, and a 90%. And why don't I use 100%? Because if it's 100%, it's not a risk, it's an issue. And you don't put it on the risk register. If it's less than 100% probability, you manage it as a risk. If it's 100%, you put it as an issue and you manage it differently. The other thing would be on your impacts, because a lot of people don't think in terms of dollars. We just have them use just ranges. So it's a low impact. If they say a low impact, that would mean less than 2% of the contract value. We're going to use 2%. A medium might be 2 to 10% of the contract value. We would use 10. And then if they say a high impact, that's 10 to 30, we use 30. Obviously, this depends on your risk tolerance as a company and really the size of the project that you're working on. But these give you some rules of thumb, and then what I wind up doing is when they say it's 2% of the contract value, well, that's $2,000. Does that seem right? And they may say, oh, no, I was thinking it'd be a lot more than that. So you give them the three numbers, and they just basically, no, it's not going to be 30,000, but it's more than two. Okay, well, let's use 10,000. So it just shortens that process up in getting that working. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to give you an example of a potential risk event. Then we're going to drill in and actually what are the drivers of the risk. Now this might be to start off with, this is the risk statement, or excuse me, the project statement that you're going to state to the team, and they're going to have to drill into this and figure out what the risks are. So in this case, your team's performing a industrial automation project for a new client that'll automate its entire feed manufacturing facility from door to door. It's a new client for us that has at least 10 other feed mills that will also need automating in the next couple of years. The facility has no automation currently, and the operators have very limited computer experience. The client's maintenance staff has also never worked with any computerized automated equipment, and it's much more comfortable with working with relay logic. So this might be the statement that the PM would give about the project to the team for them to get started. The other things I would include in a typical one be, we're going to use this particular technology platform. We're going to use this type of hardware, and give them a little more detail around the delivery, give them some time frames. We've got 8 months to complete the project, but in this one, I just wanted to focus on a few things here associated with that. So now you're going to start asking, what are the potential negative risks that we might have here? So a negative risk might be, we've got a new client. Operators don't feel comfortable with computers. Maintenance staff doesn't know how to troubleshoot this type of equipment. There's a positive risk in this statement. We might actually be able to pick up 10 more projects from this company if we do well on it. So this would be the risk events that would be identified in the meeting. But now we have to actually drill in and see what is it that's risky about those events. So, if you think about a new client, what's risky about a new client? It might be that you don't think there's any risk associated with it, but maybe the last 10 times you worked with new clients, it took you longer to figure them out than the project did, and you wind up learning some things by the school of hard knocks as you went. So, new client, you could impact that, you could fix that issue or mitigate the risk by working on establishing processes with this new client, figuring out what drives their buttons, and what really keeps them working and what makes them successful from their perspective. There's all kinds of things we can do with operators not feeling comfortable with computers, but the risk itself is they don't feel comfortable with computers. We're going to look at drivers that we could actually impact, though. All right, so in this scenario, though, how would we figure out what the impacts are? Well, let's just think about the individual drivers here. So we've got operators that don't understand computers. They maybe are, maybe the issue is, I think that's going to take me longer on site because we'll be babysitting them for an extra 2 weeks. That might be what I'm really concerned about. So I start looking at, all right, that's going to cost me some money if I have to stay on site for an extra 2 weeks. So there's a couple of ways to do this, though. You might sit around and use some quantitative, events. If you limit yourself to 20, 40, 60, 80% probability and limit yourself to 6,000, 30,000, 90,000, this is a $300,000 project and we're limiting it to 2, 10, or 30. So you give, basically, this is a method that I've actually gotten from the Agile development methodology. They use what they call throwdown cards. And so you give every one of your participants a throwdown card for 6, 30, and 90K, and you give them a 20, a 40, a 60, and an 80% probability card. So you say, first we're gonna figure out what the probability that this risk is gonna happen. So you give everybody a chance to pick their card. They throw down on the table, you spread them out, and you see you've got 120, 180, and then the rest of them are 60s. So what you wind up doing is you make the guy that hit through the 80 explain why he thinks it's an 80. You make the person who did the 20% explain why they thought it was 20. Everybody picks their cards back up, and we throw down again. And almost without a doubt, when you throw down the next time, everybody will be at the same number. And it's typically the 60, but sometimes it turns out it goes to 80 because they just, yeah, wow, I never thought about that. And you do the same thing with your, with basically your impact number. Use the throwdown cards, let everybody vote. You pull them up and you make the low and the high explain, and then you re-vote. I've never had to go more than 3 cycles to get 100% agreement with a number, though. So it's a, it's a decent method to do it. It's not perfectly accurate. You don't really care at this stage. You're really just trying to figure out which is my riskiest events out here that I need to focus on. So use some method to do that, though. Now, at this point, you're going to build your risk register. You're going to take all those events that you just use that information from. You've got your event, the drivers, the probability, the impact, and we will a lot of times fill in our impact drivers. They may be a little bit different than the risk driver itself. And then what's the total probability of this? So you calculate your score. The way they would do it in the book is you take probability of the risk times the probability of the impact times the total impact, which gives you a score. So in this case, we had a 70, a 90, and 42,000 was our impact, comes up with a risk score of 26,460. Okay? So this gets recorded in a risk register. Now I'm going to zoom in on just this first part here, but you'll have these in your slides that you can go back and zoom out on and look at what those look like. But so your risk event goes in the top line right under, kind of the header. Then your drivers go underneath there. Now you're only going to fill in the drivers at this stage. You're not going to fill in prevention plans yet, because you're not going to build a prevention plan for every risk that you identified, but you're really trying to get your overall risk score. And if I go back up to this slide, you wind up calculating. You can put this in a spreadsheet, and then it'll just calculate out, based on my probabilities that I entered, the risk score for this. But you'll notice I've got other things in here like risk owner, date open, date closed, hours. We do this in a SharePoint site. So you enter them in a form. It does all the calculations. It just records them in the SharePoint site. But prior to that, we did them all the time in Excel files. So now the issue is we've got to prioritize the risk. So and the reason you want to is because you can't actively manage everything you identified. You want to spend your time on your highest impact, really your highest risk score items. So we use the top 3 to 5. So you're going to look at your risk register. You're going to sort them by risk score, highest to lowest. We take the top 3 to 5, and then we have a number. We usually say anything that has the potential to affect your contract by more than X%, we still have to monitor it. So it could be that we're monitoring and controlling 10 risks, but most of the time, the top ones are in that 3 to 5, are the ones that we're really monitoring. But that'll also depend on how risk averse your company may be, how many of those you want them to manage. But it's kind of a corporate decision. We're going to manage the top 3 to 5 and those that will exceed anything more than X%. But what really happens to the rest of the risk on your register, they stay there. You're going to use that list, you're going to look at that list every time you do a risk review meeting, because some of those risks you may have thought were very low impact or the probability was very low, and all of a sudden something changes and they move up to the top of the list, and now I've got to actively manage those. Then we're going to look at resolving the risk. Really, how do we reduce the probability of the risk event or lessen its damage if the impact if it occurs? So again, we're working on the risk and impact drivers here. We're not working on the actual risk statement itself, but the drivers of those. So this is what's going to decrease the probability that it's going to occur and or decrease the impact if it does occur. So our action plans, though, need to become schedule tasks, or however you track your things that need to be accomplished on the project, because you're going to assign a person to them. You're going to put a time frame to them, meaning, we need this done by X date in order for this risk to not be realized. And we need to figure out, what's the place to put all this stuff. So the reason it's important, though, is if you don't track it like a schedule item, it's not as important to the team as their task to complete the work. So if you put it on the schedule and they're assigned that, or you put it in their list of work that they have to do, it's a lot more likely to have something done with it. But not everything requires a risk response plan. There are obviously, and this comes right out of PMBOK as well, there's these other things you can do. You can try to avoid the risk, which means I'm going to eliminate it by avoiding its cause. So if the risk is associated with we're using new technology that we've not applied to this industry before, you have the choice to go back and use a more known technology. So that would be a risk avoidance. Go back to the original technology that team knows best. But just keep in mind that, if you don't use new technology or you try to avoid every risk, you're not going to learn as many things. So it does affect your learning and growth of the company if you avoid all risks. Your other options, transfer. Sometimes you can transfer it to someone else. Oftentimes when we're doing our customer kickoff meetings, we bring the original brainstorm list of risks. We let the customer see that. Sometimes they say, don't worry about that. I'll take that one. That's great. We don't have to mess with it. Sometimes you can get a insurance policy that at least will cover you if that risk happens. But be thinking about ways you can transfer at least the impact to someone else. You might hire a subcontractor to do work on new technology that you haven't done. Obviously, it brings some other risk into the project, but it might solve your technology issue. You can choose to accept it. You just say, if it happens, it happens. You hold back some contingency to cover that if it happens. But I've got no way of controlling this. I'm just going to accept it. And then the last one is mitigating, and we're really going to spend the time, that's the one that you're building your risk response plan for, and where most of your time is going to be spent. All right, so this is one of those examples of using a risk statement like one of the companies that I had gotten some information from. So here's how they would format that. Given that ABC company operators have very limited computer experience, there's a possibility that the operators will have a difficult time picking up the new system, with a consequence that the startup will go at least a week longer than planned and to hand the plant over to the operators. So just made it an easy statement. Everybody looks at that. They know what we're after. We've got a potential week-long slip in schedule. That's the real risk here, that we have to stay on site longer. It's going to cost us money. I can come up with an impact for that. So if you think about that, though, what are some options? Well, I gave this example. at the annual conference, and there were a wide variety of things that came out. Well, I mean, obviously, one thing you could do is just accept it. I'm just going to spend the extra week on site if I have to. That's accepting that risk. If you want to mitigate it, though, some options could be do some training on just how to run Windows on a PC. I mean, physically, I have seen this happen where we've been, and I'm sure all of you guys have. I went to this control room. They had never had a computer. All their operators were, in their 50s, and they didn't even know what to do with a mouse. So it was pretty obvious we're going to have a problem here. But by doing some computer training, there I could go to them and say, hey, I think your team is going to need some just Microsoft operating system training. I could do that for you if you would like. I can give you a change order for that, or I can look for someone that could do it for you and let them contract it to you. But here's the risk that I think you're going to have if you don't do this initial training. So you can usually get a charge up from that owner. So the goal is, we're going to go try to do a sell-up opportunity here. We're going to get another option might be get that system out there in simulation mode, set it in a conference room somewhere, let them play with it for 2 or 3 weeks before the startup so they're at least used to it, and you're not having to spend all that time working with them. Okay, and then we're going to move right into monitoring. Goal of this step, we need to know that our action plans are working. If they're not working, we need to replan our action plan here. If we're successfully mitigating the risk, we're retiring them off the list. And, basically, we might be identifying new risks or taking other risks that were on the risk register. They now have become a lot more important, and we move them up on the list and start managing them. So that's the goal of monitoring. We really have to think about, though, how often should you do it, and I really think it depends on the size of your project. If you've got a month-long project, you may be looking at risk every week. If you've got a 12-month-long project, it's probably a monthly meeting that you're reviewing that. Maybe take one of your weekly meetings that you do, and once a month you add review of the risk register and brainstorming any new ones that may have come up. But one of the items that I find is a good best practice is every time, if we're doing a scheduled 3-week look ahead at our weekly meeting every week, if one of those risk action plan items shows up in the 3-week look ahead, since I have them in my schedule, that's a great time to do a risk review meeting. But anytime you're meeting with key stakeholders on the project, it's good to go through and actually spend some time looking at the risk ahead of that. And then closing the risk, obviously some risks will fall off of your list. But really, the only way it actually comes off your list is if it's successfully prevented from occurring, its time component has passed and it didn't occur. So we either completely mitigated it, it's no longer a risk because we're past that stage of the project, the design phase is over, so it's either happened or it's done and then we don't have to worry about it. Or the risk actually occurred and you've now moved it, it's now 100% probable, you've moved it off of your risk register and moved it to your issues list. And you're still managing it, but you're managing it differently. And that's really the only things that will pull it off your risk, off of your risk list. So what do you cover in these meetings? Look at the risks that are currently under active management. Have any of the drivers, the risk drivers or the impact drivers changed, or have any of the impact amounts changed? Modify the risk register, resort it, see if you still need to modify. You may have another risk that you've identified a long time ago that came up in impact, and now you need to start monitoring it. Look at those, decide if any probability or impact has changed, and then the last thing is really are there any new risks that we've identified that weren't even in our minds when we started this project? So if there are any new developments that might have brought a new risk, take those and see if you can come up with a risk mitigation plan, or at least give them their impact and probability to see if they fall in that top 3 to 5. And you may have to start managing that one as well. So here is basically just a quick overview again of the steps. You're going to identify, analyze, prioritize, resolve, monitor, and then you're just going to keep repeating those steps, and that's your overall process. What I wanted to do is just very quickly talk about the resolving risk step here, because on the resolving side, realize that your mitigation plans, just think about that in terms of not everything there is going to be just me working on it, my team working on it. You may be able to talk your client into helping with some of the resolving of those risks, and obviously it doesn't take as many of your man hours to do that. But I do also want to make sure we all realize this takes money and time to do. I think most of us feel like that, risk management is an important process to do, but we put very minimal effort into it. And what we found is you get out of it what you put into it. So if you do a nice job of reviewing your risk and putting those things in a method where you can actually analyze them and act on them, you put them in your schedule so that they are tasks that people are associated with. Now you reap some results on the other end. Since we've started this new methodology, especially on that front-end customer kind of kickoff meeting, it's been amazing to me how we've really drilled into what the client finds as important, and by knowing those things, we know which risks that we need to be really watching for and working on. It's made a tremendous impact on just the negative things that happen, as well as those positive ones that we've ran into. So that being said, I'm gonna open it up for questions and discussions, but I did want to throw this up while you're doing that, so you guys have a chance to write this down. This is our reading material. It's called Proactive Risk Management by Preston Smith and Guy Merritt, and then there's my contact information if you'd like to call me directly on it. So let's open it up for some questions here.
Okay, Jeff, I don't see any posted yet, but I encourage our 99 attendees, that's how many we had today, it was a tremendous turnout, to think about what questions you may have and put them in the Q&A box. One thing I will mention is a number of years ago, I don't know how many it's been now, the Best Practices Committee developed what's called a Project Risk Assessment Template. And it's located in the Resources for Managing Your Business library in Connected Community. Now, I just went back and looked at it. It's been a while since I've seen it, and it doesn't fully align with what you're describing, but it is a spreadsheet that poses questions you could ask and then gives you the opportunity to do some rating. So it's a good start. Jeff, you mentioned a register. Is that something that is available publicly, or is that something that Interstates has developed?
I'd be glad to put that out on the Connected Community. I'll send it to you with the PowerPoint that we can post as just resource materials for this. It's one that I actually created based on this e-read here. As I read through it, I figured out what they were really trying to monitor, and it's very easy to tweak. It's not our custom material. It's something that we actually have a little different risk register that we use on SharePoint anyway. So yeah, I'd be glad to share that one. Okay, very good. Thank you. That's very, very generous.
I do have a question came in here. What were the internal barriers to implementation of the risk management process in your organization?
That's a good question. Obviously, one of the things that has helped us as we started building more of a professional, what I would call a project management office, but really our guys, our project managers, that's their only focus right now. So they're not technical. They don't have to be. I'm an engineer and I can do some technical, but my focus has always been on project management. So when you move them out of the role of being mostly technical and a little project management, that transition goes a lot better. But you know, the thing that really happened when the rubber really hit the road for us is when I started working with each of the project managers on their risk registers. We were always doing a risk register for, I don't know, probably the last 10, 12 years, but we weren't doing well at mitigating the risk. So I just started taking with them and practicing asking the why questions with them on their risk. And when we started drilling into what was really driving their risk, all of a sudden the light bulb just came on, and they started realizing I'm asking all the wrong questions. And when you ask it that way, and we came up with the real reason why this is a risk, it was an easy risk response. So not that it was easy to implement, but I knew what I needed to do at that point. So that's what really helped us in the implementation is me spending time with them, looking at their risk registers, and me acting like I'm just asking all the why questions and letting them come up with answers. And sometimes we had to bring the team back in to do that. But now they ask the why questions. So I see there was one as well on just being transparent. How transparent are you with your customers on risk? That's a great question too. Typically at the first kickoff meeting that we do with our clients, our risks are fairly vague at that point. We know that we've got a technology risk. We will not talk about the technology that, say, we don't have as much training in it. What we talk about is this is a new technology to the industry and how it might, we're not sure how well it's been proven in the industry yet. Now, obviously that might bring up some concerns, but then we also have the backup to that as well. We do have some proven technology that's been used in this industry that we're willing to put in as well. So, but you do, the schedule risk, we usually are very transparent with that because they're the guys that are going to be, sometimes they're the ones in control of that. We want them to know how that could impact them in the end.
I have two more questions coming in from Brian. He has two questions. I'm going to state both of them. What is the most common risk that you have encountered across the project, and do you practice this risk management process in all projects or only on product of a certain size scope?
Okay, good. I'm going to answer the last one first because that is a very obvious, we cannot do it on every project. We choose anything above $50,000. If it's $50,000 in labor revenue, and that's just been a random number that we picked, mainly because that's the size projects that my full-time project managers will manage. Below $50,000, between 30 and 50, they will still have a risk register. It'll be fairly minor. Below 30, we won't typically do a risk analysis unless there's just something really big on the positive side that we can exploit. But that's a great question. So the second half of that, could you repeat that first part one more time?
Sure. What is the most common risk that you have encountered across projects?
Okay. It's very common that you will, when you use, and this is why we always, or I shouldn't say always, but almost always use that prompted list in the meeting, because you almost always got a schedule risk of some sort. It may be because, we're the size of projects that we're doing, we frequently get liquidated damages rolled into the contract terms and conditions. So schedule is a big one, very typically. New customer, we do a lot of work for new clients that have potential, they've had either really bad experience before, or they just haven't ever done this before, haven't ever been involved in automation before. So those are very common, but I'll have that in the slide presentation. If you look at that prompted list, I think you're gonna look at that and say, oh yeah, we've had that one occur on lots of projects. You'll see several of those in there, but it is common. That's the bad thing, is that you can get in that mindset that they are always gonna be the same. You do need to look at, and that's why that risk, kind of the overall project statement that you put together as a PM to talk about the project with the team for this risk review meeting is so important, because there you're going to try to give them a big picture overview, kind of a 30,000-foot view of the project. And if you don't do that well, everybody's going to just go back to the risk is normal. So the negative of having a prompted list is that may be the only things they ever think of. The positive is it gets them thinking about potential risk.
I do have another question coming in through chat. Is this a good idea to include a risk analysis in your weekly, monthly report, project report issued to the client?
Oh, that's a great point. So we do have the ability in our risk register to kind of classify if this is one that we want to make public, if we want the owner or the GC to know, because when we generate our weekly, so let's say we're going to have a monthly meeting with the client, this agenda that will come in will have our risks at the bottom and what we're currently kind of got as mitigation plans on them. I find that most of the time we just talk about those risks, and we don't, if they're going to affect, if they have a potential to help us impact the risk, then we'll have the discussions at our, at our monthly meetings with them. But in our weekly meeting, the risk will always be at the bottom of our agenda. We may not cover them at every week, but the list will always be there. So if somebody just, on the team had a question about a risk that's coming up in the next 3 to 4 weeks that, I need to have done something, they see them every week, and they can start asking questions when they see they're bumping into their 3-week look-ahead window.
We had a question that Joan had asked, how transparent are you with customers on risk? And I think you just answered that based on the previous question. Would you agree?
Right.
Okay, very good. Joan also asked, how much risk analysis do you do pre-sales? Pre-sales is in quotes.
Yep, that's a great question. And I would say we don't do as well on it at the pre-sales. We do a preliminary risk analysis, but it's typically the estimator and the sales lead guy, the one that came up with the lead, do a preliminary kind of risk analysis, but it's not with the entire team. That one, I would say, takes very little time for them to come up with. But once the project is awarded, all of those risks transfer directly to our risk register for us to at least consider in our brainstorming meeting.
Mm-hmm.
But it is definitely different. The amount of effort we put in it at the pre-sales process before we send the proposal, unless we see some very blatant things, or we've worked with that GC or the general contractor or the owner before and had some big issues, the list is pretty small at the pre-sales site, for us today anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I see there was one there about, is it normal for PMs to be incentivized on risk avoidance and risk mitigation? Currently, we don't. Where we do it is in, we have what we call pay for performance bonus program, but it's related to a lot of different things. We do a monthly random audit of, basically we call it a PM excellence program, but of all the different things that a PM is supposed to do, which risk is one of those, we analyze those at about 10% complete and about 50% complete on the project, and just do a random sampling audit of all the projects that are going. They get a score from there, and part of their paper performance bonus at the end of the year is going to be based on how well they scored in those. We don't do any project bonuses to date. We put it all back into a general pool for bonuses based on how well we increase the overall gross profit on all projects. So we don't want them to only focus on their own project. We want them to be helping other projects that may be struggling as well.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, do you see the question from Harold?
Yes. So risk management template into your bid process. What we did, this is a very similar, the one that we use is the template that's on the Connected Community. That's our pre-sales template. So it has a whole bunch of questions, and you score those questions, and then that helps you to come up with a kind of what I would call it's a pre-sales risk score, and depending on how high that number is, that will affect how much contingency we put in the project during the sales process. So I would really encourage you to get out and pull that template off Connected Community, because it's a really good template to use for that. It helps you a tremendous amount in just thinking about the risk, but then also, how do I account for this risk in my contingency?
Yeah, because I believe there's value in identifying potential major risks during the proposal phase so that they can be discussed, and if a risk does occur, how's it going to be mitigated, who's going to pay for it, and I think clients would appreciate an integrator who identifies things that could, of significance, that could potentially go wrong, but you won't know until you're actually into the project. But to have a discussion up front, I think is in an integrator's best interest to have that discussion with the client.
Right, and it's, on certain projects, we may just say we're going to increase the percent of contingency. Other projects, when we do a very nice job of identifying the risk and putting a risk score, a dollar value score, we actually would use those dollar values as our contingency. So if we thought the schedule slip was going to cost us $20,000, the contingency is if that's the only risk, the contingency would be $20,000 plus if we need some reserves for known unknowns. But we would use that to come up with our contingency number.
Very good. And just for our listeners, just to repeat, that project risk assessment template that's on Connected Community is in the resources for managing your business library.
Right, and there's some other really good resources out there as well. There's some templates for, like quality management plans, and a few templates that we've just put out there as generic templates to use in your business. Project plan template. I'd encourage you to go looking out there on Connected Community for those. Mm-hmm. And I will publish, I'll give to Bob this risk management register, the risk register, so you can look at that, decide if there's, there could be things you would like to use there, or maybe tweak it a bit for your own use.
Yeah, I'll put that in the library along with the project risk assessment template. Good. That way they'll be together. Mm-hmm.
You bet.
I had two more questions coming in.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And Jeff, I don't know if you answered this before, but I'm going to read it out to you anyway. Within your internal risk meetings, how do you address internal resource conflicts, shared resources? Or how do you decide how to satisfy resource risk across multiple projects?
Yep, and that is actually, I was going to joke around that, that never happens on my projects, but it happens on almost every project. So, one of the ways that you have to approach that, that's going to be an issue on lots of projects. So we've built in, one of the things that we're trying to do is build some more gaps in projects so that resources don't get too many of them on top of each other. But really the biggest issue is when you've got projects go long that, you know, now we're 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks longer than we anticipated, and they're butted right up to the other project. We do cover those. What we have done is we actually have a support team that is, you know, they handle our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week support of our clients, and they're highly technical, you know, across multiple platforms, and we'll use that team to kind of get started on a project, get the other project going, or we can use them on startups. So if we get into a situation where we're going long on a startup, we can bring that team, you know, someone from that team in. But it is obviously, you have to have, I actually call it rolling reserves. I have to have some reserve there that I can pull from that's capable enough to, it's not my entry level guys, it's capable enough to be able to pull into a different type of a project that may not be as good at it as the team member would be that was assigned it, but they can at least save my butt in a bind. But we have lots of meetings associated with that when we're doing risk reviews and we realize we got a resource constraint. We'll bring in that other project manager and we'll negotiate, you know, with that other PM. And most of the time we've been able to resolve the conflicts, but it's a big deal. There's no doubt about it.
I had one more question, Jeff.
Okay.
This is coming in from Jerry. Regarding pre-sales risk, do you encounter clients that demand a firm project schedule prior to releasing the PO? How does operation handle this?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Typically, our projects require at least a high-level schedule, not a detailed how we're going to do it schedule, but, you know, proving out that they've given us an end date. They've told us they need this up and running by August 1st, and we have to at least come up with enough of a schedule to prove that we can get it done in that time frame. Now, obviously, all the design and everything that has to happen in the middle of all this is really going to be based on, you know, we're going to have to get in there, figure out how to deliver it. The pre-sale side of it is really just, you know, helping them feel comfortable that we can do that. Once operations is handled, you know, once they're handed the pre-sales schedule, they have to figure out how they're going to get design done in the time frame. And, you know, typically there's enough fluff in there, whether it's in design or in the actual development side, that we can move it around, or we can bring additional resources in if we need to. But our pre-sales typically doesn't have a very detailed schedule in it.
And I have one more question came in from
Sure.
Jim. How often do you conduct risk review meetings?
Okay. And it really does depend a little on your size. It will be no less than monthly. One of our weekly meetings, project meetings a month, we will incorporate it. On smaller projects, you know, let's say it was a month-long project, we're likely going to do it weekly on those. But it's a very short part of it might only last 10 minutes. In this monthly meeting, it might be an hour to half an hour to an hour of your regular meeting. I'd say oftentimes we can get it done in a half an hour. But these short projects, it's a 10-15 minute weekly discussion about the risk and are we on top of our mitigation plan. Great.
Okay. I think that's the end of the questions. I don't see any others that came in. So with that, to all the attendees, those who are still on the line, I want to thank you for your participation. And actually, most are still here, even though we've exceeded our typical hour. My hope is that you have several takeaways that will enhance your company's project management, particularly risk management capabilities. And Jeff, thank you very much for your contribution of time and expertise, and your presentation was really very insightful. we wish the best for you and for Interstate Control Systems, and you guys keep up the good work. You're a shining star of what a system integration company should be, and we always appreciated all your involvement on the board and you personally on the board as well as on the Best Practices Committee. I want to also thank Monica Anderson and John Weber from Software Toolbox for being the gracious host and sponsor that they are for all of our monthly educational webinars. And I ask our attendees, please complete the survey that is going to come to you in your inbox in a very, very short period of time. It takes like 30 seconds to complete, and it helps us know how we're doing. There's just, in closing, there are just 3 important considerations I want to tell you about. First of all, the exchange. You've probably heard the phrase, get on it. It's an amazing tool for end users to find an integrator or a product and answer. So I encourage all of our integrator members to go for the gold profile. It really is the best value. Number 2 on the list is if you have ideas for the 2015 conference, whether it be content or format, the planning of the conference will begin very soon. So please send that to me, Executive Director. You can find my email address on our website. And lastly, number 3 is the August webinar is more on project management, specifically front-end loading. That will be by Dan Roesler, and he's an author and also a former system integrator. If you would have a topic for a suggested topic for a webinar in the future, please include that in the survey comments. So again, this is Bob Lowe, Executive Director of CSIA. Thank you so much again for attending. Take care. Goodbye now.
And I am stopping the